So let us just dive right into this one. Today, we are taking a look at a really massive ideological shift.
Oh, it is a huge shift.
Yeah, we are tracking the political strategy of Dan Bongino, and specifically how he went from this 2012 mentality of, stay and fight in your blue state to a totally modern strategy of relocation, evacuation, and starving the beast.
Right, which is just a complete 180-degree turn from where he started.
Exactly. And our sources for this deep dive are a whole stack of text excerpts, quotes, and video analyses. We are looking at his early broadcasts, his 2012 Senate run in Maryland, his commentary during the COVID-19 pandemic, and then eventually his tenure as FBI deputy director in 2025 and 2026.
Which is a fascinating timeline to unpack.
It really is. And our mission today is just to impartially unpack how a political figure completely redefines the concept of what it means to, quote-unquote, fight for his followers.
Yeah.
How you shift from geographical loyalty to total ideological segregation.
Yeah, and we really need to set a disclaimer right at the top here.
Yes, absolutely. We need to be very clear. This deep dive is strictly an analytical look at the source material. We are not taking sides here.
Right, no sides.
We are not endorsing his views on, tyrannical liberal states or freedom-loving conservative states. And we are definitely not taking a side on the defund the police movement or anything politically charged from the left or the right.
We are just reporting on the ideas that are contained in the original sources.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine listening to a politician in 2012 telling you to relish the fight in your home state, right? And then a decade later, that exact same voice tells you to pack your bags, take your money, and run.
It is a profound psychological whiplash. I mean, you rarely see a political figure who builds an early brand on the romance of a local uphill battle, only to eventually argue that the battlefield itself is fundamentally toxic.
Yeah, that it literally must be abandoned.
Exactly. To go from stand your ground to strategic relocation, well, it requires completely dismantling and rebuilding your audience's definition of what it means to actually fight.
Right. So let us anchor ourselves in that baseline mindset. Let's go back to the 2012 Senate campaign in Maryland.
The messaging from that era is just incredibly earnest.
It really is. I mean, the sources quote him exactly, saying, "The fight is here. Why would you leave? Relish this fight. Take it in. Fight in your home. Don't leave."
Which is such a traditional American political model.
Right. The idea that the system fundamentally works.
Precisely. The 2012 rhetoric is built on this bedrock assumption that you can, persuade your neighbors, you knock on doors, you engage in town hall debates.
You put forward a better argument.
Yeah, and you win at the ballot box. It is the classic mechanism of federalism. At that time, Maryland was viewed by his campaign not as a lost cause, but as a viable battleground.
Like a place where conservative ideas could still gain traction.
If the base simply put in the work and refused to retreat.
Which requires a monumental level of optimism, right? Especially in a state that heavily leaned toward the opposition.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to genuinely believe that demographic majorities aren't permanent. You have to believe the political machinery is fair, that the votes are counted squarely, and that civic engagement actually moves the needle. He viewed himself as a general leading a charge to retake his home state.
And when you view yourself as a general in that context, you are implicitly setting a moral standard for the troops.
Oh, that is a good way to put it.
Right. By framing geographical presence as the ultimate contribution to the cause, staying in Maryland becomes an act of patriotism. It is a very romantic, almost cinematic view of politics.
It is like the captain refusing to go down with the ship or defending the Alamo.
Exactly.
But let me ask you this. If the foundation of his platform in 2012 was, don't leave your home, isn't there an inherent risk of alienating your most loyal believers when you later do a 180-degree turn?
Oh, it creates an inevitable collision. You are essentially asking an entire movement to uncouple their political identity from their physical communities.
Which is huge.
It is massive.
Yeah.
So that uncoupling doesn't happen overnight. A general doesn't just wake up one morning and decide the war is over.
Right.
That requires a systemic shattering of the initial optimism we just talked about.
And looking at the timeline, that shattering was deeply personal. Because how does a general abandon the battlefield? He doesn't, unless he faces personal defeat.
Which brings us to his own experiences in Maryland.
Right. The shift from relishing the fight to evacuate the premises was basically forged in back-to-back electoral defeats.
Yeah, he ran for the Senate in Maryland in 2012 and lost.
And then 2 years later, he ran for Congress in Maryland and lost again.
2 high-profile, incredibly taxing campaigns in his home state, both resulting in a brick wall.
So how did those personal failures shape his macro strategy?
Well, those losses became the crucible for his ideological transformation. He didn't interpret those defeats as mere statistical blips or, the result of a flawed campaign
I mean,
strategy.
we took it much further.
He did. He came to a stark macro-level realization. The political machinery of the state was, in his own words, insurmountable.
Insurmountable. That specific word choice is heavy.
It completely changes the game.
Because if a challenge is difficult, you try harder. But if to challenge is insurmountable, any further effort is irrational.
Exactly. And he took it a step further in his post-mortem analysis. He concluded that he was, quote, fighting for people who didn't want to be saved.
Wow. That is a massive psychological pivot.
It really is.
By saying he was fighting for people who didn't want to be saved, he is effectively shifting the blame from the limitations of his campaign directly onto the electorate itself.
He isn't saying my message didn't land. He is saying the voters are fundamentally broken.
Right. Which leads us to what the sources call the legislative point of no return theory.
Yes. This is where his personal failure morphs into a macro strategy. He rationalized his exit by declaring that states like New York, California, Illinois, and eventually Maryland had undergone demographic and cultural shifts so deep that traditional campaigning was now completely obsolete.
Here is where it gets really interesting. It is fascinating how a personal inability to win an election becomes the proof of concept for a nationwide thesis.
Right. Because he couldn't beat the Maryland political machine, the logical deduction became that the system was rigged. The opposition, as he framed it, owns the referees.
And if you sincerely believe the referees are on the other team's payroll, stepping onto the field isn't brave, it is foolish.
Playing the game validates a corrupt system. The only logical response is to walk off the field entirely.
And he literally walked off the field. I mean, his personal template was moving from New York to Maryland for the Secret Service and eventually leaving Maryland for Florida.
To escape the high taxes and the political climate.
Right. And what strikes me here is the profound psychological shift from public servant to private citizen. He goes from being a guy actively trying to reshape a community through public office to prioritizing his own family's life, health, and future.
Which significantly improved after his move to Florida, as he frequently points out.
But if we extrapolate this, what happens to a political movement when its leaders decide certain territories are permanently lost?
It shifts from a national strategy to a highly regional defensive posture. It shrinks the map.
Right. But personal electoral defeat, even when extrapolated into a larger theory, usually isn't enough to uproot millions of everyday citizens, is it?
No, not at all. A politician losing an election in Maryland might explain why he moved to Florida, but it doesn't explain how the concept of strategic relocation became a moral mandate for his listeners across the entire country.
That requires a massive shock to the system.
Exactly. It took twin catalysts, two massive nationwide crises, to turn this personal choice into a directive for his followers.
So let's talk about those catalysts.
Well,
Catalyst 1, spanning 2020 to 2021, was the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. During this period, the messaging really kicks into overdrive. He stops talking about just taxes and starts talking about tyranny.
He heavily focused on the lockdowns and mandates in states like New York, California, and Illinois, specifically highlighting the closing of local churches and small businesses.
Which completely pivots the narrative from a political disagreement to a matter of survival.
Right. In 2012, it was about tax policy and federalism. By 2020, Bongino framed staying in blue states as a direct threat to personal safety and freedom.
And that sense of active danger was exponentially amplified by the second catalyst,
which unfolded simultaneously from 2020 to 2023, urban crime.
Following the 2020 protests and the defund the police movement, he leaned heavily on his background as a former NYPD officer.
Right. He issued stark warnings to residents of major urban centers, places like Chicago, Portland, and San Francisco.
And he didn't just criticize the city councils, he applied a very specific, highly charged label to these cities. He called them failed states.
Failed states. Wow.
What is fascinating here is the application of that specific international geopolitical term. In international relations, a failed state describes a nation where the central government has completely collapsed.
Where the rule of law is non-existent.
Right. We use it to describe war zones.
So by applying international geopolitical terms to American cities, you completely change the social contract for the listener.
Exactly. You don't vote to fix a failed state. You don't petition the mayor.
You evacuate it as a refugee.
Right.
But let me push back on this a little bit, thinking about his background. If he is a former NYPD officer, doesn't abandoning the city go completely against the traditional law enforcement ethos of protecting the community?
It absolutely does. The traditional civic expectation is that the strong stay to protect the vulnerable.
Right. It's like a doctor walking out of a hospital because the disease is too contagious. I mean, you are asking the listener to weigh the balance between self-preservation and civic duty.
But he flips that analogy on its head. In his framing, the doctor isn't just dealing with a natural outbreak. The hospital administrators are intentionally weaponizing the disease.
Oh, I see.
When the institution itself is the enemy, staying and fighting within the rules of that institution isn't noble, it is suicidal.
So if staying is no longer an option for survival, then leaving is no longer an act of surrender.
Exactly. It becomes the new definition of fighting.
Which leads us to the practical realities of this whole thing. Section 4 of our sources outlines the economics of this exodus, the strategy of starving the beast.
Yes. Moving is framed as a strategic withdrawal, or voting with your feet.
And his argument is basically that staying in deeply blue cities means you are an ATM for the radical left.
The phrase ATM for the radical left is brilliant rhetorically. It tells the listener that every time you pay property taxes or buy groceries in the state, your money is funding policies that destroy your conservative values.
So the directive is to move your talent, your family, and your money to build something new.
But we really need to deeply analyze whether Starve the Beast is truly an effective macroeconomic strategy.
Right, or is it simply a moral justification for wanting a more comfortable political environment? I mean, does removing a fraction of the conservative tax base actually bankrupt a state like California or New York?
The empirical data suggests it does not. What actually happens is you hand total unopposed control to the opposing party.
Because if you physically remove the opposition, there is no one left to vote down tax increases or challenge regulations.
Exactly. And evaluate the redefinition of courage here. In 2012, courage was staying. Now, courage is uprooting your life to deprive the enemy of resources.
But we absolutely must address the practical risks for followers based strictly on this command to move money and family.
It is a huge logistical blind spot.
Because the text tells his audience to take their money and talent elsewhere. But what about the followers who don't have the means?
Moving is a luxury.
It really is. Think about the logistics. You have to sell a house, find new jobs, move kids to new schools, and doing all of this is a political act.
It demands a level of liquid capital that many people just do not possess.
Exactly. So if you are a low-income family in Chicago or Portland, and your favorite commentator is telling you the city is a failed state, but you literally cannot afford to move, where does that leave you?
It leaves you completely stranded.
Does this advice unintentionally abandon the most vulnerable members of his own base?
It essentially does. It creates a massive divide. The rhetoric traps those low-income families in a state of perpetual anxiety. They're told they are living behind enemy lines, but they don't have the funds to evacuate.
Wow, that is incredibly bleak.
But for those who do have the means, this evacuation strategy doesn't stop at physical relocation. It extends to every aspect of life.
Which brings us to the parallel economy. From 2021 to the present, there has been this massive push to move businesses, digital footprints, and money away from liberal-dominated institutions.
Right. It is an evolution into what the sources call Federalism 2.0.
Meaning, you are no longer trying to share a state, but rather you are building a completely separate, parallel society.
Exactly. Moving your digital footprint means changing banks, changing social media platforms, and only shopping at conservative-owned businesses.
So what does this all mean?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it means giving up on the American experiment of pluralism.
It is an admission that coexistence is impossible.
Right. And this messaging inherently creates division among his once loyal base. There is a growing schism between those who stayed and those who left.
Contrast the psychological experience here. You have a follower who stays in Maryland, remembering the 2012 Relish the Fight message. They stayed, they fought.
And according to his new rhetoric, those people who stayed are now subsidizing their own destruction.
And contrast that against a follower who moved to Florida and feels totally liberated. They are the evacuators.
Exactly. And this is where his recent attacks get really interesting. He is now actually attacking the people who previously supported him, the ones who chose to stay.
Wait, really? He attacks his own former supporters?
Yes. Instead of supporting their right to choose for themselves where to live, he is now calling them doomers and gloomers.
Oh, wow. So he goes from telling them to stay and fight in 2012 to now calling them doomers and gloomers for staying.
Yes. It is a frequent point of criticism from his detractors, this shift from stay and fight to move and starve.
So how do his detractors and former hardcore followers from 2012 view him now?
Well, many of them question if this evolution was a brilliant tactical pivot or just a cynical abandonment of the very ground he once swore to defend.
A lot of his previously hardcore followers are now questioning if he is just acting as a propagandist.
Right. They ask, is he just pushing a narrative that benefits his own lifestyle choices in Florida while leaving the most vulnerable behind?
It is a very tough pill to swallow for someone who believed in that 2012 mission.
Absolutely.
So, just to concisely summarize this journey, we have gone from a 2012 general demanding loyalty to the local battleground.
To an evacuator preaching a completely parallel economy and geographical sorting.
Right, all in response to personal defeats, lockdowns, and urban crime. And for you listening, I want you to reflect on your own communities.
It is happening everywhere.
Have you noticed this voting with your feet phenomenon happening around you? How does it change the flavor of your city or state when political opponents physically leave rather than debate?
It cements the divide.
It really does.
Okay.
But before we wrap up, there is one final, incredibly provocative thought from the sources that we need to touch on.
Yes, and this is the thought to leave you all mulling over. The text notes that Bongino eventually served as the FBI deputy director in 2025 and 2026.
Which is just a staggering paradox.
Yeah. Think about it. If a central piece of your ideology is that blue states are failed states, and that conservatives should build a completely separate parallel economy to starve them out,
Right.
how does that philosophy operate when you are suddenly appointed to the top levels of the FBI?
A federal agency tasked with protecting all states, both red and blue.
Exactly. Can Federalism 2.0 survive inside the federal government, or does it inevitably lead to two separate Americas?
Not just in rhetoric, but in the actual enforcement of the law. It really makes you question, how his previously hardcore followers view this leap from parallel economy propagandist to federal executive.
It is the ultimate contradiction.
It really is something to think about as you watch these strategies play out. We deeply appreciate you joining this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you next time.